The hum of the 18-wheeler's engine filled the night air as Matthew Keller gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles pale against the leather. He had been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, the kind of grueling haul that tested not just endurance, but sanity. The highway ahead stretched into black infinity, the painted white lines flickering like a heartbeat in the beams of his headlights. Outside, the world was silent, no cars, no towns, not even the faint glow of distant farmhouses. Just emptiness. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the cab like a living thing. Matthew had been on long runs before, but there was something unsettling about this stretch of road. According to his GPS, he was cutting through a forgotten section of interstate in the Midwest, a route truckers avoided whenever possible. His dispatcher had warned him that few drivers bothered to come this way anymore. Too many stories, she had said with a half-laugh, like she didn't believe them but didn't want to tempt fate either. Still, it was the fastest way to meet his deadline, and deadlines were all that mattered in his line of work. He turned the dial on his CB radio, hoping for the familiar chatter of other drivers, even just a truck stop clerk wishing someone safe travels. Instead, all he got was static. He tried the AM band, cycling past distant stations that came in warped and distorted, as though voices were being dragged underwater. Every now and then, a phrase would slip through, half a weather report, a snatch of an old country song, but nothing clear enough to hold on to. With a frustrated sigh, he killed the radio and let the rumble of his tires on asphalt be the only soundtrack. Hours passed without a single set of headlights in the rearview mirror or oncoming lane. The isolation began to gnaw at him, an ache at the back of his skull that made him glance at the mirrors more often than he should have. Sometimes, he swore he saw shapes at the edge of the road, silhouettes like deer or coyotes frozen in the dark, but when the headlights swept over, there was nothing there. His mind kept insisting it was exhaustion, but a whisper of unease lingered. This was more than being tired. This road felt wrong, as though it wasn't part of the same map he'd started on. At mile marker 113, Matthew noticed something strange. The same battered green road sign, reading Ashbrook, 17 miles, had appeared for the third time in less than an hour. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, then leaned forward against the wheel. He could have sworn he hadn't passed any exits, hadn't taken any wrong turns. Yet somehow, the distance to the next town never changed. The odometer told him he'd driven nearly 70 miles since first seeing it, but the road refused to give way to progress. The thought landed heavy in his chest. Either the highway was playing tricks on him, or he was already trapped in something far worse than exhaustion. Matthew's eyes kept darting between the road and the clock on the dashboard. It read 2:17 a.m., the cruelest part of night when exhaustion dragged at his muscles and shadows seemed thicker than they should be. He took a swig of lukewarm coffee from a travel mug, grimacing at the bitter taste, but it did little to shake the weight pressing against his eyelids. He considered pulling over, just for a half-hour nap. But the idea of stopping, out here, in the middle of nowhere, made his chest tighten. He didn't want to find out what silence might sound like when the engine was no longer running. Trying to distract himself, he flicked the CB radio back on, even though it had been nothing but white noise earlier. At first, the static buzzed in the same broken rhythm as before. Then, faintly, a voice cut through. A man's voice, low and crackling. "You're not supposed to be here." The words drifted in and out, distorted, but enough for Matthew to freeze with his hand hovering over the dial. He leaned closer, heart hammering, straining to catch more. The channel hissed again, then another phrase came, jagged and sharp, "Turn back, before Ashbrook." Matthew's skin prickled. He snatched the mic, pressing the button down. "Breaker 19, this is Keller, anyone out there? You're coming through broken, repeat." His own voice sounded too loud in the cab. For a few seconds, there was only static. Then, like a whisper caught between frequencies, he heard laughter. Not warm or human, but hollow, dry, the kind of laugh that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the hiss of empty air. He let go of the mic and swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his hands damp on the wheel. Maybe it was just a prank, some local kid with a scanner playing games. But how would anyone know his name? He hadn't introduced himself on the channel. He hadn't said Keller into the mic at all. His heart pounded harder as he replayed the voice in his head. No, that wasn't right. He was sure it had been before he spoke, before he'd even picked up the radio, that the voice had already known. Outside, the landscape hadn't changed. The same endless two-lane stretch, the same flickering sign promising Ashbrook, still 17 miles ahead. But now Matthew noticed something else, movement in the mirrors. Just at the edge of the truck's red taillights, far back on the asphalt, was a shadow that didn't belong. It was low, sprawling, and it shifted every time his eyes tried to settle on it. He blinked, looked again, and it was gone. But the hollow laughter from the CB echoed in his mind, and for the first time in years behind the wheel, Matthew Keller was afraid of the dark. Matthew tightened his grip on the wheel, the leather biting into his palms. He told himself he'd imagined the shape, a trick of light and exhaustion, nothing more. But every few minutes, his eyes betrayed him, sliding toward the mirrors, searching the ribbon of darkness stretched behind him. Sometimes he thought he saw it again, a blotch against the glowing red tail lamps, a distortion in the air itself, but each time it slipped away when he tried to focus. He had driven long enough to know the dangers of fatigue, blurred vision, phantom sounds, even hallucinations. Still, hallucinations didn't laugh through CB radios. To shake himself, Matthew reached over and cranked the radio to a different frequency. At first, only static, the white noise washing through the cab like waves. Then, faintly, another voice rose up, a woman's this time. Her tone was soft, broken by interference, but the words came through clear enough to make his chest tighten. Don't stop for them, no matter what. The transmission collapsed into shrieks of static before he could respond. He stared at the radio, his breath shallow. Don't stop for who? He thought. But a colder realization followed quickly. The voice didn't say who. It said them. His headlights caught a glimmer ahead, reflecting off metal. A sigh of relief slipped through his lips. Finally, another sign of life. A roadside reflector, maybe a parked vehicle. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into an old sedan, battered and caked in grime, parked half off the shoulder. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, casting pulses of orange into the night. Beside the car, a man stood waving both arms, frantic and desperate. Matthew slowed instinctively, his hand hovering over the turn signal. Maybe it was a breakdown. Maybe someone really needed help, but then his stomach knotted. Something wasn't right. The man's movements were too stiff, his arms jerking up and down in a rhythm that felt almost mechanical. Worse, in the quick flashes of hazard light, Matthew noticed the man's face didn't change, no mouth opening to shout, no brows furrowed in distress. Just a pale, blank expression as the body flailed unnaturally at the edge of the road. The words from the radio echoed in his head like a scream. Don't stop for them. He swerved, staying in the right lane, and thundered past the stalled car. The man didn't chase, didn't call out, he simply froze mid-motion as the headlights swept over him, standing statue still in the rear-view mirror. The hazard lights kept blinking, but the figure was no longer moving. Matthew's pulse slammed against his ribs as he pressed harder on the accelerator, fighting the urge to look back. Whatever was happening on this road, he knew one thing for certain now: he was not alone out here. The adrenaline from the close call with the stalled car kept Matthew's eyes wide open, but it wasn't the kind of alertness he wanted. His heart still hammered, and his throat burned from breathing too fast. The road stretched on endlessly, the hum of the engine loud in the cab. He told himself he made the right decision. Stopping for anyone on this road was suicide. But that didn't mean the decision sat easy. Truckers lived by a code: you helped when someone was in trouble. Tonight, though, that code felt like bait. Another road sign appeared ahead, washed in his headlights. His stomach dropped when he read it. Ashbrook, 17 miles. The exact same one he had seen before. The green metal was bent, the lettering rusted, identical in every detail to the others. He checked the odometer, swore under his breath. By now, he should have been in the middle of town or at least seen the glow of its lights. Instead, it was as if the road itself was looping, keeping him trapped in a corridor of asphalt and shadows. Not long after the sign, his headlights revealed another figure. A woman this time, standing on the shoulder with her hands clasped together, as if begging for help. She wore a long dress that stirred in the night air, but when Matthew slowed instinctively, he realized the folds of fabric weren't moving naturally, they hung stiffly, unmoving, like part of a costume or display. Her head tilted as he drew near, her eyes glinting in the light, too reflective, almost animal-like. He slammed the gas and barreled past without a second thought. In his mirrors, the woman didn't move an inch, watching him vanish into the night. Then came another. And another. Every few miles, some new roadside figure materialized, a man crouched beside a pickup truck with no hood, a child standing barefoot at the edge of the road, even a group of 3 people holding hands in a silent chain. None of them spoke, none of them chased, but their stillness was worse than movement. Each time, Matthew's instinct screamed at him not to stop. Each time, the CB crackled faintly with static, as if unseen voices were waiting to cheer the moment he gave in.by the 4th or 5th encounter. Matthew's nerves were stretched to breaking. His hands trembled on the wheel, sweat dampening his shirt. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figures weren't random, they were waiting. Lined up along this endless highway like performers in some grotesque roadside play. But who were they performing for? Him. The thought tightened in his chest like a vice. They weren't just there. They were there for him. Matthew had settled into a terrible rhythm, eyes on the road, breath shallow, hands locked on the wheel. Every mile or so, another figure waited on the shoulder, frozen in place, watching him pass. He forced himself not to look too long, not to study their faces or clothes. It was easier to think of them as props, illusions born of exhaustion. Easier to pretend. But deep down, he knew better. Illusions didn't multiply. Illusions didn't whisper warnings over CB radios. The next roadside figure appeared just beyond mile marker 118. At first, it looked like another mannequin, an old man in a flannel shirt and suspenders, slumped in a lawn chair at the edge of the asphalt. His head tilted toward the sky, mouth hanging slightly open, eyes glassy under the wash of headlights. Matthew gritted his teeth and prepared to drive past, but something made his stomach knot before he even reached the spot. The man's hand twitched. It was subtle at first, just a finger drumming against the chair arm. Then, as the truck drew level, the old man's head snapped downward with impossible speed, his vacant eyes locking onto Matthew's. His jaw dropped open wider, too wide, unhinged like a snake. In that instant, the figure sprang to life, leaping from the chair and lurching into the road. The truck roared forward, the man's pale hands slapping against the passenger side door with a metallic bang. Matthew swore and jerked the wheel, nearly throwing the rig into the shoulder. The old man's face filled the passenger window for a fraction of a second, skin gray and sagging, mouth stretched in a grotesque scream that made no sound. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness behind. The echo of the impact rattled through the cab, but there was no dent, no mark, nothing to prove it had happened. Matthew's breath came in ragged bursts, his pulse screaming in his ears. For the first time since the trip began, he truly wanted to abandon the load, to pull the truck off and never look back. Before he could recover, the CB crackled to life again. The same dry, hollow laughter he had heard earlier spilled through the speakers, followed by a single phrase, "Don't run. You'll never get out if you run." Matthew's chest clenched. The road was no longer just watching him, it was toying with him. Matthew's pulse hadn't slowed since the old man hit his truck. His knuckles were bone white on the wheel, his breath shallow and uneven. He kept glancing at the passenger window, half expecting the face to appear again, plastered against the glass. But there was nothing, just his own reflection, pale and trembling in the faint dashboard glow. The silence in the cab was unbearable, heavy as a blanket of lead, then the CB hissed. At first, it was only static, familiar and almost comforting in its mindless noise. But beneath it, faint and rhythmic, came a sound that made Matthew's stomach turn, breathing. Not his own, it was too slow, too deep. A low inhale, a rasping exhale, looping like someone was pressed against the microphone on the other end. He reached for the dial to shut it off, but before his hand touched the knob, the breathing stopped. And a new sound replaced it. A voice, passenger side. Matthew's head snapped right. His headlights flashed over another figure on the shoulder, this one crouched low, hands pressed against the pavement, head bowed like an animal ready to spring. His chest tightened as the figure twitched, preparing to leap. But instead of lunging at the truck, it did something far worse, it began to run alongside him. For a full 10 seconds, the shape kept pace with the semi, its limbs jerking unnaturally fast, head still hanging at an impossible angle. Then it dropped back, swallowed by darkness. The cab felt tighter than ever. Matthew forced his eyes forward, but the mirrors betrayed him. In the passenger side mirror, just above the blur of his taillights, a shadow leaned too close. At first, it looked like his imagination. Then the shape tilted its head, mirroring the exact way Matthew had tilted his only moments before. He swerved, his chest heaving, but when he looked again, the shadow was gone. His hands trembled so violently he could barely keep the truck centered on the lane. A cold draft brushed the back of his neck, carrying the scent of something damp and sour, like rotting leaves after a storm. Matthew froze. The windows were up. The vents were closed. His gaze crawled toward the passenger seat. For the first time that night, he wasn't sure he was alone inside his own truck. The cab felt like a coffin. Matthew kept darting glances at the passenger seat, each time half expecting to see someone sitting there, grinning in the dim glow of the dash. But it remained empty. Still, the air was colder now, his breath visible in faint puffs against the windshield. The heater was on full blast, yet a damp chill clung to his skin. His mind screamed at him to keep his eyes on the road, but the pull of that seat was irresistible. Something was there. He could feel it. The CB crackled again, softer this time, as though the voice was trying not to wake someone. "Don't look at it," the whisper slithered through the static, making Matthew's skin crawl. He slammed his palm on the switch and cut the radio entirely, but the words still echoed in his ears, too vivid to dismiss. His throat tightened as the seat creaked faintly, leather groaning as though weight had shifted into it. He dared a sideways glance, and froze. Indentations. The passenger seat cushion sagged slightly, as though someone unseen was sitting there, legs crossed casually. His chest constricted, his knuckles aching against the steering wheel. He forced his eyes back on the road, whispering curses under his breath, trying to pretend it wasn't real. But then the smell hit him, wet soil, copper, and something sweetly rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. He gagged, pressing a sleeve against his nose, but the stench only thickened, invading his lungs with each breath. He couldn't resist anymore. Slowly, like pulling off a bandage, he turned his head. His heart nearly stopped. A figure sat beside him now, translucent, more shadow than flesh, but human-shaped. Its face was pale and indistinct, features blurred like a memory of someone half-forgotten. Yet the eyes shone unnaturally bright, reflecting the dashboard lights as if made of glass. They didn't blink. They just stared. Matthew's scream tore out of his throat before he realized it. He wrenched the wheel, nearly throwing the rig into the opposite lane, and when he looked again, the seat was empty. The indentations remained for a moment longer, then smoothed out as if nothing had ever been there. The cab fell silent except for his ragged breathing. But Matthew knew the truth. The figures weren't just lining the road anymore. They were inside with him. Matthew's throat was raw from screaming, though he barely remembered making a sound. His grip on the wheel trembled, and sweat stung his eyes despite the freezing air in the cab. The seat beside him looked empty again, but the memory of those glassy, unblinking eyes burned in his mind. Every nerve in his body told him to stop, to fling the door open, to run on foot if he had to. But another part of him, colder and sharper, whispered that if he left the truck, he'd never come back. The highway ahead glowed pale in his headlights, but something was wrong. The white lane lines had narrowed, the edges of the road creeping closer as though the asphalt itself was shrinking. His hands twitched on the wheel, keeping the truck steady. Then the beam of his headlights revealed them, figures, no longer just scattered along the shoulder but standing directly in the lane. Dozens of them. Men, women, even children, perfectly still, lined across the asphalt like a wall of mannequins. His heart thundered. No. No, no, no. His foot pressed the brake, but the pedal resisted, stiff and unyielding, as if the truck itself refused to stop. Panic surged through him. The figures didn't flinch. They just waited, staring into his lights. He swerved hard at the last second, the semi howling as it veered across the opposite lane. Tires screeched, but somehow, impossibly, he missed them, though his mirrors betrayed a different truth. In the red glow of his taillights, every single figure turned its head in unison to watch him pass. Inside the cab, the temperature dropped again. Frost spread across the passenger side window, delicate white veins crawling across the glass. The dashboard lights flickered. A faint laugh, hollow and broken, rose from the empty seat beside him. It wasn't through the CB this time. It was right there, in the cab, inches from his ear. He slammed his hand against the seat, desperate to feel something solid, but his palm passed through nothing but cold air. The laugh stopped, then came the whisper, soft but unmistakable, rising from everywhere at once, from the seat, from the mirrors, from the static still bleeding faintly through the dead CB, almost there. Matthew's chest seized. He realized then that whatever waited in Ashbrook wasn't salvation. It was the destination they had been leading him toward all along. The highway straightened, the narrowing lanes giving way to a stretch of road that felt almost normal. Matthew's grip on the wheel was iron, his eyes burning from strain, but he refused to blink. For the first time in what felt like hours, distant lights appeared on the horizon, faint, yellow, and wavering like candles in a storm. His chest surged with relief. Ashbrook. He whispered the name like a prayer, though part of him recoiled at it. They had been leading him here. Every mile, every figure, every whisper, it was all to get him to this place. As he drew closer, the lights resolved into old-fashioned street lamps, their glass cracked and covered in grime. They cast halos that barely cut through the darkness. The town emerged around them, rows of buildings, crooked and weather-beaten, their windows empty and black. Storefronts sagged under collapsing awnings. A rusted gas station loomed on one corner, its pumps eaten away by corrosion. Yet every sign, every storefront bore the same name in faded paint, Ashbrook. It wasn't a town. It was a hollow shell of one, as though the idea of a town had been copied and left to rot. Matthew slowed, the semi groaning as it rolled down the deserted main street. No movement. No people. Only silence and the faint hiss of his engine echoing between warped buildings. He wanted to believe it was abandoned long ago. He wanted to believe it was just another dead Midwestern town. But then he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. They stood in doorways, leaned against lamp posts, peered from cracked windows. The same blank faces he had passed on the roadside, now populating the hollow streets. Waiting, his breath hitched when he realized they weren't just staring, they were arranged. Every figure faced the road, forming a corridor of pale bodies leading deeper into town. Their heads tilted slightly in unison as his truck rumbled by, their glassy eyes catching in the lamplight. For a moment, Matthew thought he heard them whispering, faint voices bleeding together like wind through reeds. Then, from the CB, though he had smashed it silent earlier, came the same phrase as before, clear and deliberate, almost there. At the end of the street, a single building glowed faintly from within. A church, its steeple bent and broken, stood taller than the rest of the town. Its stained glass windows flickered with orange light, as though fire burned inside. Every figure in the street turned its head toward it in unison. Matthew's stomach turned to stone. Whatever waited for him in Ashbrook, it was inside that church. And whether he wanted to or not, he was being driven straight to it. The semi groaned as Matthew rolled it to a stop in front of the church. His hands shook so badly he could barely shift into neutral. Outside, the figures closed in behind him, filling the street like a tide. Their faces remained blank, their movements perfectly synchronized, but their silence was worse than any scream. They weren't chasing. They weren't attacking. They were guiding. Herding him toward the church, the orange glow behind the stained glass pulsed like a heartbeat, shadows writhing across the cracked windows. Matthew forced himself out of the cab, boots crunching against broken asphalt. The instant his feet hit the ground, every figure in the street tilted its head in unison, their glassy eyes following him. His legs trembled, but he kept moving, drawn toward the doors as if invisible hands pushed at his back. The church loomed, its broken steeple like a finger pointing to a dead sky. The doors opened without his touch. A blast of heat washed over him, carrying that same sweet rot he'd smelled in the cab. Inside, the pews were filled, not with parishioners, but with more of the roadside figures. Row upon row of them sat perfectly still, their heads tracking him as he stepped inside. At the far end, beneath a shattered cross, stood an altar. Behind it, a figure taller than the rest emerged from the orange light. Unlike the others, its face wasn't blank. Its features shifted constantly, flickering between faces Matthew recognized from his life, co-workers, family, even his own reflection, before melting back into a blur. Its voice filled the church, layered with static and whispers, as though 100 mouths spoke at once. You drove the road. You saw the signs. You came to Ashbrook. The crowd of figures leaned forward slightly, their collective motion sending a shiver through the air. You belong to us now. Matthew staggered backward, his mind screaming for escape. But behind him, the doors slammed shut. The orange light swelled, consuming the windows, flooding the church with fire. The figures rose from the pews in perfect unison, surrounding him. He tried to shout, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the light. His last sight before the world dissolved was the shifting figure at the altar stretching out a hand, its glassy eyes locking onto his. Outside, the semi sat idling on the empty street, cab door still open. The church stood silent and dark once more, its stained glass dead and colorless. The town of Ashbrook waited, as it always had, for the next driver who would not be able to resist the road.